Good evening, and welcome to all of you to the Bental Lecture in Christian Theology. My name is Tinu Ruparell. I'm an associate professor in religious studies at the U of C, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this special event in the life of the Chair of Christian Thought. Tonight we launch Christian Thought in the 21st Century, Agenda for the Future, a collection of essays of scholars who've been invited to speak to us under the auspices of the Chair of Christian Thought over the number of years. And many of these talks, I'm sure many of you have been able to enjoy in the past as well. The idea for this book came about, as many good ideas do, when my co-editor Doug Shantz, myself, and a number of other people in the advisory group to the chair were tucking into our pancakes at a breakfast meeting. Wouldn't it be great if we could make available to a wider audience some of the wisdom, some of the writings of the fantastic people we have had the pleasure to welcome to the chair? And I think it was Doug who came up with the idea to ask all of our contributors a couple of key questions, one of which was, how has your mind changed over the course of your career? I'm sure many of us could reflect on that for ourselves. And another question, what challenges do you see facing Christianity, Christian thought, the church in the future? Well, a list of contributors was drawn up. We sent out letters, we got replies, and then the business of collecting the essays and editing them, putting them together, and then finding a publisher for it all began in earnest. It took quite a time, I don't mind admitting. But what we do have now, and we're very happy with, is a really fine collection of essays from really stellar scholars. I hope you get a chance to look at the book. The book is for sale down at the back over there through the U of C. And some really, really interesting essays, lots of food for thought, things that you can easily discuss with your friends and family. So before we bring up other people here today, I just want to tell you what's going to happen. Firstly, we'll have a presentation of the book to Dr. Betty Craigie, and she'll give us a few words. And then we will have a chance to hear from some of the contributors to the book in our panelists today. Each panelist will have some time to discuss various parts of the book, and I'll introduce those as we get to that point. And then afterwards we'll have a chance for some discussion from the floor, a brief presentation about how you might be able to use this book in study groups, and then finally some time for book signings and refreshments. So let me now ask Professor Doug Shantz and Dr. Betty Craigie to come up and give us a few words.
When you arrived this evening, you got a couple of things to put in your hand, and one of them is a short biography of Peter Craigie that I put together with the help of some other biographers, especially Lyle Esslinger, one of my colleagues here at U of C. To make a long story short, I don't think we'd be enjoying this event tonight. Certainly we wouldn't have this book, and nor would I have the position of Chair of Christian Thought were it not for Peter Craigie, who back in the early 80s had the vision for this chair. And so appropriately, this book is dedicated to the memory of Peter C. Craigie and his vision for the Chair of Christian Thought in Calgary. And so it's my pleasure now, first of all, to express my debt of gratitude to Peter Craigie, and also to you, Betty, for your encouragement over the years. Many thanks.
Well, thank you, Doug. Now I've got two books, because I brought this one just in case he wasn't going to actually give me one. As the only person up in front here who has absolutely no credentials in terms of knowledge about Christian scholarship, I'm going to say a few words. And primarily I want to thank Drs. Shantz and Ruparell for so thoughtfully dedicating this book to Peter's memory. I was present for the conception of the idea of this book in Smitty's Pancake House, as I remember. As I was, somebody thought it would be a good idea if I was a member of the advisory committee, so I filled that role for a number of years. We wanted to mark the 20th anniversary of the chair, as it then was, in a significant and lasting way, and I still cannot think of anything better that we could have done. This is a remarkable achievement. This is a remarkable achievement. And it's wholly in line with what I remember as the original concept of the Chair of Christian Thought. I commend Dr. Shantz and Ruparell for their determination and ultimate success, and it wasn't easy, in the production of the book, and also for the excellent introduction, which you will read when you buy the book. And I would likewise commend Dr. Virginia Tumaj, and I don't know if she's here or not. Hi, Virginia. So I've lost the place. For an excellent summary at the beginning of the book of the chair's philosophy. So I shan't repeat that because you can all read it when you buy the book. The idea when the chair was founded, and I do remember this, was to have notable scholars in Christian thought resident and functioning full-time in the University of Calgary for several years each. This worked for a while until the endowment became insufficient to support it, and some resourceful souls developed the current model. It doesn't matter that it had to be changed, because now it works well. And I mention this to reflect that a really good idea can outlive its creators, even if some modification is necessary. I think Peter Craigie was something of a luminary. And when such people leave us, we still need to carry on the vision left behind without the presence of the inspirational leader. The spirit of perseverance has brought us not only a continuing expression of Christian values at the university/wider community interface, but now also this book, an enduring distillation of the combined wisdom of many speakers over the years. It's especially pertinent in these times when thoughtful people are struggling with expression of their faith in today's world, where Christian belief is no longer automatically accepted or even known. I've begun to read this book and have found it to be more than once quite moving. I find a sense of relief and uplift in the experience of having someone else articulate well a thought that I have long been fishing for. Here is informed companionship for those of us who continue the quest in our own milieu. And I shall be recommending it to a number of people I know. In fact, I might even buy more and give them to them, because they really, really ought to read this. This is probably the last time I shall be heard saying something like this. But in an environment where one may make statements which can never be proven, I will state that Peter would have been well satisfied with this development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we move on to our panel discussion part of the evening, and it gives me pleasure to introduce to you our panelists, all of whom were contributors to the volume and also colleagues of mine. I'll go from here to there. Dr. Terence Penelhum, he's an emeritus professor of religious studies at the University of Calgary, where he was formerly head of philosophy, dean of arts and sciences, and the director of the Calgary Institute for Humanities. He also helped found the religious studies department, it doesn't say here. He studied at the universities of Edinburgh and Oxford and has had many visiting appointments at universities in Canada and the United States. His primary academic interests are in the philosophy of religion and the history of modern philosophy. His books include God and Skepticism, a study in skepticism and fideism, Butler, and Themes in Hume, the Self, the Will, Religion. and more, and is associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at U of C, where she's taught courses in religion and film since 1995. She's a member of the steering committee for the Society for Biblical Literature, consultation group on Bible and film. Her other research interests focus on Christian origins and Christianity in late antiquity, with an emphasis on women during these periods. Her publications include Search for the Common Judaic Understanding of God's Kingship in Wayne McCready and Adele Reinhardt's edited collection, Common Judaism Explored, Second Temple Judaism in Context. And finally, Dr. Douglas H. Shantz is professor and chair of Christian thought at U of C, where he's served since 1999. His research and writing focus on radical movements in early modern German Protestantism. His recent books are Between Sardis and Philadelphia, The Life and World of Pietist Court Preacher, Konrad Brusk, and a new introduction to German Pietism, Protestant Renewal at the Dawn of Modern Europe. Welcome our panelists. They'll have each 15 minutes or so to discuss, and then we'll just move on. I won't introduce each of you again. And then after that, we'll have a chance to pose some questions to them. So, Professor Penelhum.
I'd like to talk as in a relaxed a way as I can, because I've been given a strict time limit, even though the clock on behind me has no hands. I'm not taking that too seriously as a fact of life. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Betty, colleagues, I've been asked to speak about the articles in section 2 of this book. I think I've been asked to speak about those because I happen to be one of the contributors in that section. Philosophers are supposed to be able to talk about anything, which is just as well, because this is a very diverse collection of papers. I'll make it easy for myself, and I hope for you, by starting with my own essay, because I can summarize that fairly clearly, and I know more or less what is in it. Now, most philosophers would classify the work I do in philosophy as analytical philosophy. Now, calling it this puts it in a tradition that I first encountered when I started my graduate studies in Oxford in the, well, I may as well come clean, in 1950. This movement in philosophy was a conscious attempt to return philosophy to the standards of clarity and written elegance that it exhibited in the 18th century, with the addition of some developments in logic that were due to Bertrand Russell. It was a movement that was very suspicious of speculation, and it became suspicious also, inevitably, about all claims about human beings and their place in the universe. So there was a lot of skepticism about religion as well. This is still very much part of analytical philosophy, but it has been matched in recent years by the growth of a large group of Christian thinkers who've used the tools of analytical philosophy, that's to say concern for clarity and exactitude in meaning, and they've enlisted all this in the service of the Christian religion. Now, I myself was brought up as an Anglican. I left the church after a period, and then returned to the Anglican Communion, which I rejoined in 1978. So I ought to be pleased about these developments. And on the whole, I am pleased, but I have reservations. And in the essay, I give a brief account of three of the leading Christian philosophers of our time. They all insist they're not theologians, they're philosophers. And then I give a list of my reservations. Now, my reservations center on three things, as I see them. First, what I call the ambiguity of the world. By this I mean the following. I think it's rational to believe. But I also think it's rational to disbelieve. Now, would the world be like this if Christianity were true? I don't think that unbelievers can be blamed for being doubtful, not in our world. Now, if you go to St. Paul in the first chapter of the Epistle to the Romans, he says otherwise. So my first question is, why should we believe him on this? My second reservation comes from the fact, which we all know about now, the fact of religious diversity. I think the kind of standoff I've just described between believers and unbelievers applies to the relationship between one religion and another religion in our world. And we know a lot more about that nowadays than we used to. And I think people cannot be blamed for being on one side rather than the other in this. And my third reservation comes from the scientific culture that we all share now. Christian reaction to evolutionary biology has, in my opinion, been completely inadequate. Evolutionary biology shows that death and suffering are integral parts of the creative process. And I think they force a deep these facts force a deep reevaluation of the core doctrines, core Christian doctrines of the fall and of our view of our proper relationship to other species with whom we share the planet. Now, I think Christian philosophy has a duty to confront all these issues, and I don't think it has done so adequately. That's my piece. I want to move next to another essay in this section, the one by John B. Cobb. It's about process philosophy. Now, process philosophy and process theology are movements that get a polite reference in most of the textbooks, and then people salute and pass on. And it's not a tradition in which I have any training, but I want to suggest why it's probably worth special study for Christian thinkers. Ever since Greek times, Western philosophy has thought of the world primarily in a certain way. Aristotle talks about the world being characterized by the existence of what he called substances. The world is full of substances, or beings, individual things. In fact, the basic word for a substance is not Aristotle's technical term substance, but our ordinary day-to-day word thing. Now, the world is full of things. We also call them objects. They last through time. Now, the modern thinker in the 18th century, who had most to say about the basic ideas we have about our world, was Immanuel Kant. And he called the basic concepts that we use to think with, calls them categories. And at one point he says, categories are concepts of what an object or a thing is. And he tries to define for us what a thing is. Have you ever tried to do this? You talk about things all the time. Have you ever talked about what the word thing actually means? It's very hard. But whether it's easy or whether it's hard, there's this long tradition in Western thought that the world is simply a lot of things. But we should remember that the Greeks who invented this idea never envisaged that there could have been a time when the material world that we live in wasn't there. What the idea of substance or things does for them is to make sense of a world which would otherwise still be there, but wouldn't make any sense. That was the Greek problem. Now, substance thinking raises a lot of questions. There are many features of our experience that are just as real as things are, but have to be subordinated to them to fit into this view of the world. Among these facts are actions, developments, or changes. And in substance thinking, they have to be subordinated, squeezed in somehow, to substances. Lewis Carroll in Alice in Wonderland has a great joke about this. It's the story of the Cheshire Cat. Alice sees a smile. She's bewildered by this smile that she sees until the rest of the cat's head appears. Then she knows what she's looking at. But the basic idea that Lewis Carroll is floating there is that there could be a smile without any face that it's attached to. Now, of course, that's silly, isn't it? The idea of a smile existing by itself. Yet, after all, smiles are just as important in life as things are. I wouldn't be anything like as important as I am if I didn't have the charming smile that I have. And that's true for everybody. Now, what process thought has done is to question this view. Process thought, as I understand it, and again, I'm not an expert on it, it suggests in contrast that this traditional Greek view has everything backwards, and that we live in a world where the key fact is the reality of ever-changing processes, and things are the products of those processes. Now, the key thinker here is Alfred North Whitehead, in a book called Process and Reality. It's notoriously hard to understand. The professor that I knew a little about in Edmonton said that he thought he understood it after his fourth reading. I doubt very much whether many people who actually use process notions know much about this book. But I think the suggestion that processes precede things, if it could be worked out, would be very helpful for Christian thinkers. For Christianity doesn't teach us that the world has always been here, that our problem is just making sense of it. The Orthodox Christian view, at least in the first Genesis account in the first chapter, the Orthodox view here is that at one time the world didn't exist. That it came into being because of a divine act of will. Let there be light, and there was. This in turn suggests that creation probably wasn't all over after 6 days, but also goes on, and that God keeps on transforming it through the Holy Spirit, who is an active agent responsible for continuous change. Now, I've got a volume at home called The Liberation of Life, in which John Cobb, who wrote the essay here, and one co-author engage in great, very helpful detail with some of the ecological problems of our time. And this connects with the fact that most understandings of the kingdom of God see it as an ongoing process that's located in the material world. So I think we all ought to try to take some of the notions embedded in this tradition seriously. Now, I've used up, I think, my time, but there are two essays in this section that I haven't spoken about. These are two by real theologians. The first by the late Clark Pinnock, and the second by Douglas Hall. Pinnock writes about something he calls panentheism, Now, panentheism, I think, is the view that God is not identical to the whole universe. That's pantheism. But God can be identified with a part of the universe. And he embraces the idea of divine openness, which I think is the opinion that since the world contains free decisions that haven't all been made yet, you and I each have decisions to make that we haven't yet made. God must be in the position, sometimes, of not knowing all of the future, only of knowing what the possibilities are at any given time. God may be omniscient, as the term is, but that doesn't mean he knows everything that's going to happen. He only knows what all the possibilities are, and we, if we have free choice, decide what some of them are, and he has to respond then to that. Now, Douglas Hall, in a rather sobering and rather sad essay, in my view, laments that in an era when our civilization is not a Christian one, Christians should confront the fact that their thinking has been constrained in the past by the fact that their faith has been representative of one empire or another. And he sees this as having continually threatened the centrality of Christ himself in the faith, and subordinating this centrality to a succession of issues that can only be secondarily important compared with this. I found this a very wise and sobering article. Now, these essays are very different in their character. To try to engage with them, I've had to stray well outside my own expertise, but then philosophers do that. Thanks.
It is a challenge to try to summarize about 100 pages of this book in my brief 15-minute presentation now, but I'll do the best I can. Terry, do you want to move your waters? And so I'm going to hit on some themes. This is the method that I've decided to try. I mean, I think one of the joys of this book is that the chapters are fairly small bites. The longest chapter, I think, is 9 pages. The shortest is 4 or 5. And I wanted the book to be user-friendly. Some of the material is meaty and heavy, but the chapters are short. So I'm going to try to summarize about 12 chapters in the next few minutes. Now, what are some of the themes that struck me as significant? And just, again, to put this in context, as my colleague Tinu said, we wanted the book to be a showcase for some of these great Christian thinkers of our day. And we wanted to personalize the book by asking them to talk about themselves and what they do. So it's a pretty simple framework, you could say. So in that background, that context, I was interested that several of the contributors indicated that their field of study in which they'd spent their careers has changed dramatically in the last 25, 30, 35 years. Now, when we framed the idea for the book, I think we suspected that might be the case. But Craig Evans said the last 25 years have seen a revolution in the study of the Jesus of history and in the new ways in which we now understand the Gospels. Right? And he goes on to say there's a new appreciation for Jesus' Jewish identity and Jesus' Jewish setting. And he unpacks how that has changed the study of the Gospels. There was a time, in fact, a time when I went to seminary and to university, and it was all about the Greek background and the secular context of the Christian writings. Now the emphasis is on the Jewish setting. Denis Renevy, who is a scholar of medieval English literature and lives in Switzerland. Yeah, by the way, if you begin reading his essay, he talks about looking at Mont Blanc in the distance. I mean, I thought this was very unkind, actually. Here as I sit in my house looking at Mont Blanc, scholarship shouldn't be that. I mean, you're confusing vacation and scholarship here. Something wrong here. He says that his field has changed to an almost unrecognizable extent in the last 25 years. And he mentions several ways in which this is so. He concludes by saying, the things that I choose to study and the ways that I study them are totally different, right? The canon, what are the main things you study when you study English religious literature? He says the canon's been turned upside down. When he began his work as a doctoral student and the way he thinks about his field now, it's an entirely different subject matter. Another person is Marguerite Van Dee, and I'm straying into Anne's field, sorry. She says, the historian's craft has witnessed a sea change with a shift in methods from looking mainly at political history and institutional history. I know when we went to high school, what was history? It was politics, it was wars, it was military. Where now the interest is in gender history, common people, popular culture, social historical questions. It's a different subject. In a similar way, Margaret Miles, who is an historical theologian, says the field of history has changed enormously in the last 25 years. And I'm quoting these people. She says it used to be elitist and intellectualist. When you studied church history or studied theology in seminary, you studied Augustine, you studied Luther, you studied these great men, right? Right, Murdo? You studied Calvin. Sorry, I left him out. She says, it's taken decades for me to learn the skills I've needed to teach social history, gender theory, the history of art and architecture and music. Instead of just teaching these great male figures, she now teaches art history, music history, popular culture, gender history. It's a different subject. And she goes on to say she thinks that theological training today needs to change as well, because we live in a different world. And then finally, Margaret Somerville, in some ways, hers is the most dramatic of all. She says, my field didn't exist in the 1970s. It's quite an astonishing chapter by Margaret Somerville. She says, in 1970, if you were to talk about bioethics, she said there were maybe 7 articles in English in the field of bioethics in the 1970s. 7 articles. That's it. No books. By 1990, there were 200 centers devoted to bioethics in North America and over 15 journals. And so, again, dramatic change. Now, my reflection on this is almost a plea for sympathy. Those of us in the academic world constantly have the feeling we're not keeping up. We can't keep up. One has to come to terms with that somehow. Because we can't keep up. We feel overwhelmed. We try to carve out, I think people make fun of scholars, well, they have such a narrow area of expertise. It's called survival. If it's not fairly narrow, we almost have nothing to say. We can't speak authoritatively about anything. The second theme that I've chosen to focus on is the theme of globalization. And I think almost a third of the contributions highlight the theme of globalization and a companion theme of pluralism. The globalization idea is that the world is in front of us. The world is, we can't, as Livingston spoke of, darkest Africa. There's no part of the world that's dark anymore, at least the part above on the land. There are certainly mysteries out there, but the world is no longer a strange and distant place. The world is in our face. And he goes on to say that even if he had wanted to study Hinduism or Buddhism when he was a student, the materials simply weren't there. They were still in Tibetan or classical Chinese. He says, what a change. Everything is in front of us on our computer screen, and it's translated. Not everything, but so much by comparison. So that's what he means by globalization. Pluralism is the exuberant diversity of religions that confronts us every day. It's one thing to know that there are people on the other side of the world who are not Christians. But it's another thing to have the diversity of religious belief and conviction, people rubbing shoulders with us and living next door to us, and it's a more vivid reality than ever before. And this brings with it certain implications. The contributors to this volume think through what these new realities mean for us. One is that certain kinds of religious education are now obsolete. We no longer have the luxury of acting as if our particular faith is the only faith. There was a time when we could get away with that. We can't get away with it anymore. And he's talking even about seminaries, even schools that are devoted to training clergy or whatever. They can't get away without teaching the world religions and giving a good acquaintance with the nature of the diversity of religious pluralism. And this is, of course, the diversity of religions, but even the diversity within Christianity. My friend James Payton, James and I went to Westminster Seminary together in Philadelphia, and then we did our PhDs together at Waterloo. James Payton has been attracted to Eastern Orthodoxy in the last 25 years. And he says Eastern Orthodoxy is a much more accessible form of Christianity. And he's saying that's a good thing. He says if there's any way in which his understanding of the Christian faith is different now than it was 25 years ago, it's the impact of Eastern Orthodoxy. For Orthodoxy, James Payton observes, answers are less important than openness. A different way, and this is within Christianity, a different way of being Christian than the normal Protestant way of thinking. So that's one implication. Another implication of this globalization and pluralism is there is actually a new discipline that one can study at university now in religious studies departments, and that is the discipline of comparative theology. And our professor Keith Ward, who was recommended to me as a speaker by Tinu, Keith Ward actually practices the discipline of comparative theology. This kind of theology does not take its beliefs from any one religious tradition. Its field of inquiry is the whole range of religions and the whole range of beliefs. And so when he wants to think about what it means to be human, he consults Hindu sources and Buddhist sources and Muslim sources and Jewish sources and Christian sources. And now he's completed a 5-volume set of comparative theology. He looks at what we would think of as many of the questions that Christians ask, but he doesn't just have Christian answers. He has answers from the whole panorama of world religions. How many of you had heard of comparative theology before? Okay, good. I shouldn't be surprised. You go to Christian thought lectures. You heard Keith Ward. Keith Ward actually goes on to say that this has strengthened his Christianity. It's broadened his outlook as a Christian. He says, for one thing, he has a special interest in the Indian religious traditions, meaning the religions in India. And he's learned from them compassion for all living things. He's learned from the Indian religions acceptance of many paths to the supreme spiritual reality. He's learned to have confidence that all people can find God and all people have access to God's grace. He's learned about the need to avoid selfishness and judgmentalism and not to worry about the destiny of people in other cultures. And finally, globalization, pluralism, a third implication is, this is Paul Knitter, the Christian church must be a dialogical church. Pluralistic coexistence, living and thriving together as different world religions requires dialogue, says Paul Knitter. A third theme, and I'm almost out of time, I'm interested that a number of contributors say that the world's religions are the repositories of our most important human wisdom. Now, I'm going to qualify that in a minute, but Margaret Somerville says when it comes to ethical issues, bioethical issues, she says we need the wisdom of the world's faiths. We must make decisions about human life, human birth, human death by listening to the wisdom of the world's faiths. Paul Knitter says he's convinced that the world's religions are a more powerful tool for peace than they are a weapon for war. Now he says we're not maybe doing a very good job of showing that, but he's confident that if we apply ourselves, we can show that to be true. Now, finally, these chapters that I've chosen to highlight present a challenging agenda for the future. And this agenda, I'm just going to mention a couple of things. And this is actually follows as maybe a complement to the last point about the wisdom in world religions, the point that religion too must be critiqued. That saying that something is a religious belief does not get it free of all criticism. I think we know that today. I think we know that people who have strong convictions, religious convictions, can do great evil in the world, and that needs to be confronted as never before. I like the way Margaret Miles puts this. There's an uncanny number of women with the name Margaret in this volume, but Margaret Miles makes this point, that in studying religious texts, we must not only look at their intentions, but their impact, their results, their effects. And she says she learned that from St. Augustine. It may seem that Augustine did not intend to promote the degradation of our environment and to degrade women, but she says some of his ideas have had that effect. And those things he must be held accountable for that. We must take account of those things. So maybe I'll leave it there. I've read these, I think I'm fair in saying I've read these chapters more than anybody else. I've corrected their grammar in some cases and tried to make them readable. But I've also benefited greatly from the exercise.
I'm going to take as my starting point one particular article in the two collections I'm looking at. Alan P. Sell's article, Athens and Jerusalem, Facing Both Ways in Calgary, draws upon Tertullian's famous question about what has Athens to do with Jerusalem. Alan Sell, a previous holder of the chair of Christian thought, outlines how the chair was, still is, required to dwell in Athens for part of the time, i.e. the academy, the university, and to spend some of the time in Jerusalem, i.e. the Christian community. In pragmatic terms, this has meant that while in Athens, the chairholder is engaged in the academy through the teaching of graduate classes, undergraduate courses, interacting with scholarly groups, conducting his own research, and even attending dreaded university committee meetings. When the chair is in Jerusalem, he's involved in scheduling the 4 community town and gown lectures, serving as a resource person on various topics, and interacting with various denominations. Sell then notes that since his time as the chair, which was from 1988 to 1992, both Athens and Jerusalem have significantly changed, and he provides a brief description of some of those changes. He then ends his article with the following statement, quote, "It is my conviction that, for the health of both, the church and the academy need one another. Neither is necessarily hostile to the other, but there is ample scope for principal disagreement. So let us all face both ways, and the intellectual sparks will fly," unquote. I would suggest, upon reviewing the other articles in the 2 sections, the Academy and the City, and approaches to English literature and film, we do see intellectual sparks. However, I would suggest that these sparks are not the result of some inherent friction between the Academy, Athens, and Christianity, Jerusalem. In fact, I think a change of metaphor from Tertullian's Athens and Jerusalem may be needed and implied in Sell's title. Certainly, the other articles, while acknowledging some past friction between the Academy and Christianity, focus more on an intellectual exchange that is creative and filled with possibilities. So I would prefer to draw a metaphor from Sell's idea of looking both ways. The most renowned figure that had the capacity to look both ways was Janus, the Roman god for beginnings and transitions. In fact, Janus seems very appropriate because he faces both the past and the future, as this book does. Further, Janus, as the god of transitions, oversees places of passage, such as doorways or gates of the city, passages that see the movement of people back and forth. This seems an appropriate metaphor as the remaining articles examine the movement of ideas back and forth between the Academy and Christianity and within Athens and Jerusalem. In the articles, there are several overlapping observations. First, several of the articles view the city as a cipher for Canadian society. And in this context, there is the observation that Canadian society has changed. Particularly, as Marguerite Van Die's article notes, there has been a major shift away from a society dominated by a particular form of Christianity. She quotes the Canadian church historian Webster Grant, quote, "The image of Christian Canada, church-going, moral, and devoutedly partisan, strikes both believers and unbelievers today as somewhat archaic. Whether we like it or not, it is unlikely that the church will have sufficient authority in our time to replace it with another." And while Van Die and other authors remark on this shift, they are not prophets of doom lamenting the demise of Christianity as a governing force over Canadian society. Christianity within Canadian society is changing and transforming. Yes, there are still churches that reflect the ancestral Christianity associated with one's parents and grandparents. There are also new configurations, new expressions, and a societal focus of spirituality, which may indeed envision or enliven Christianity. In fact, it is in this context that the movement back and forth between the Academy and the city yields some creative observations and potentials for the authors. The authors note that the shift in Christianity within the city is matched by a similar transition in the Academy, resulting in a change in the way scholars research and write about Christianity and religion. The previous focus in the Academy was on, as Doug was saying, the great ideas, great men, and great events of church history. However, with the rise of religious studies as an academic field and the interaction of this field with other academic disciplines, the emphasis is now placed on lived expressions of religion. Quote, "Students are encouraged to recognize that religious idioms, symbols, and institutions do not simply reflect a world, as was the assumption in the older approaches, but that they also make a world with all of its tensions, contradictions, and ambiguities. In other words, rather than looking for how politics reflect the particular ideology of a Christian denomination or how Christianity shaped cultural formations, the Academy is now recognizing how Christianity, religion, was and is intimately part of every aspect of a life of a believer. It is more focused on how religion is actually practiced and lived rather than intellectualized. Yes, we're finally taking the believers seriously. This shift in the Academy, as some of the authors note, has not been without difficulties. The development of religious studies, as Peter C. Erb suggests, may be compared to the maturation of an adolescent. In the early decades, religious studies was concerned with constructing its own identity, and as a typical adolescent, this identity construction often involved the rejection of the previous generation. In this analogy, Christian theology is the rejected parent. Meanwhile, the adolescent religious studies has been drawing upon its peers for insight and direction. Numerous parties with anthropologists, art historians, archaeologists, classicists, economists, gender theorists, philosophers, political scientists, psychologists, sociologists, and even now geographers and neurobiologists have resulted in several hangovers and lots of headaches. And sometimes what seemed to be a brilliant idea at 2 a.m. after several glasses of wine is later rejected. However, these parties have also produced one of the most interdisciplinary fields of study, and its pride of place within the academy remains its focus on the phenomenon of religion. The issue of the rejection of the parent, though, remains for Erb. Yet, if the analogy holds, and if the insight from the other authors are taken, religious studies, the academy, seems to be in that 30 age bracket, when we reflected upon our parents and realized they were actually smart. This is evident in some of the articles that discuss literature and film. Arlette Zink muses on how the academy, with its focus on theory and interdisciplinary approaches, has produced a generation of students who are skilled in analyzing literature from countless theoretical positions. However, this scholastic exercise dissects literature to such an extent that all that remains is the autopsy report, a few specimen jars, and some bones. Zink found that it was through reading, rather than theoretical dissecting, that the joy of literature was returned to her students, and through the unlikely primary text of Milton. In other words, her students rediscovered what has been the focus of reading within Christianity: the power of a text to move, motivate, and engage in a conversation about how to live. Yes, one's comprehension of a text may be facilitated with various theoretical approaches. However, the text, the power of the text, should not be replaced. This also may be extended to the analysis of film. Christianity's previous interaction with the cinema has ranged from rejection, censorship, to appropriation. However, it is my contention that film, like literature, can serve, occasionally, when it's not Hollywood, to move, motivate, and engage the audience in a conversation about how to live life. If this is taken as the approach, then Christianity has much to learn from cinema in terms of how society is constructing new views of meaningful life, and film can be better understood through the lens provided by religion. This passage of ideas between Christianity and the academy is the focus of Lynn Skabo's discussion of Thomas Merton. She finds Merton's writings intellectual insights into the critique of consumer culture, the debasement of language, and discussions over pluralism. However, these intellectual insights are framed within the contemplative poetry and soaring prose of Merton, a literary style founded within his own mystical experience. His writings are a passage back and forth between the intellect and the experiential. Perhaps one of the most provocative articles is Wesley Court's The City and the Church. The previous articles examine the exchange between the academy and the city in terms of ideas. Court focuses on the city and the church as places. He notes that there is an inherent critique of cities within Christianity. This critique has its foundation within the prophetic writings which focused on cities as displays of wealth and vanity. It continued as the medieval church, once the hallmark of any urban site, was replaced with political and commercial buildings. Now the skyscrapers extolling the prosperity produced by free market capitalism can be read as monuments to greed and physical manifestations of social inequality. For many, they are the replacement of the spiritual with the material. However, Court moves beyond this simplistic view of the city and church and offers other ways of understanding and examining these places. First, like our mayor, Court draws from the paradigm-shifting work of Jane Jacob and her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. He notes that Jacob's work requires that one view cities not as one homogeneous place, but as a cluster of different communities or places. Therefore, what creates a vibrant city is the dynamic energy of its different neighborhoods. These different communities are usually conceptualized in terms of ethnic groups. However, the academy and churches should also be considered places within this urban space. With this observation, Court notes that both places, the academy and the church, must be reconceptualized. First, drawing upon other studies, Court states that the university is becoming a training place for skills. This is an observation, although phrased in different terms, shared by many of the authors in this collection. And as it becomes a training place for skills, it no longer serves as a place for cultural production. Visualizing universities as places for cultural production is not a call for the return to the high culture of the past with its fossilized canons of art, drama, history, literature, music, and philosophy. No, the academy should honor these traditions. However, it was also a place of intellectual experimentation that challenged previous ideas and developed new and alternative lines of thought. It is the university's place as a dynamic investigation of ideas that Court and others lament as lost. In the same vein, churches no longer occupy the commanding place in the urban space of Calgary, as when the inner city was defined by the physical structures of the Cathedral Church of the Redeemer, Knox United Presbyterian Church, and St. Mary's Cathedral. However, Court suggests that these inner city churches now have the opportunity to re-envision themselves as places. In a sense, many inner city churches are now engaged in a new form of placemaking required by the shifts in urban landscape. They are discovering new ways of relating to new communities. Though both the example of the university and through the example of the university and the inner city churches, Court stimulates a discussion about what the future holds in terms of placemaking for both the academy and the church, and I would also say as a passageway, the chair of Christian thought. In closing, the chair of Christian thought is unique given its pragmatic position within the academy in Christianity. This position has been a unique place of intellectual conversation. To return to Sell's point that the chair encourages the academy and Christianity to look both ways, and in doing so, this exchange will yield intellectual sparks. Given the current interest in Calgary in terms of revisioning ourselves as an urban center, one that is multi-religious, and given the university's new focus through the iHighs initiative that commands that we have a particular emphasis on how to integrate ourselves more fully with our community, I would suggest that the chair of Christian thought may do more to fuel flames of imagination as it continues to serve as a passage between the academy and the city.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. They've given us an excellent summary of the contents of the book, although that doesn't mean you don't have to buy it, I'm sure Betty would say. We have about 25 minutes now to open the floor to questions or comments. If you do have a question, please use the mic in the middle there. And like you, I'm sure that you'd like to hear what our panelists have to say, so I'd ask you to make your questions brief so that we can hear them.
I have a logistical question, not having read the book. Would it be recommended to start at the beginning and go to the end, or could one jump around? Do the ideas build on one another?
I'd go for the running around, the dipping in. And one of the great challenges Tinu Ruparell and I had was how to organize this thing. There was quite a diversity there. So I think I would feel free to dip in. As I said, I think it's bite-sized chapters. It'll be a fairly easy book to read from beginning to end. But I think there's something to be said for dipping in as well. So I would begin with something that interests you, that will captivate you, and take it from there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Oscar. I study world history and everything, and I've traveled quite extensively too. But what I'm saying about all this, there's not one church in the world talks about who really God the divine is. The divine God is spiritually. We can link direct to the divine. We don't need any religion to tell us what to do. I believe in the absolute. I go to the synagogue, Hindu, Buddha, Mormon, everywhere. I've been to all of them. And if I wouldn't have believed in a divine, I wouldn't be here. I can tell you that right now. And Doug, you know that. We've talked about different issues, different things. That's why when I listen to what's happening here and talks different places, we are living like the Roman Empire days, Sodom and Gomorrah, right now. Because we're worshiping man, idols, and statues. And that's completely wrong. That's why the world has fallen apart.
Oscar, do you have a particular question?
Okay, my question is, do any of you, or the world itself, the religious people believe in a divine, that's the God through the Spirit? That's the God. Everything else is man-made. All to control your mind, body, and soul. I'd like to have some comments if you would like to answer.
Anybody want to tackle this one?
I think we've had this conversation.
I'll say it again.
I think you've flummoxed our panel. Let's see if we have another question.
I'd like to make a comment on your observation, how our minds have developed in the last 25 years. And it's so true. And listening to you tonight, I thank you for helping to develop our minds. I would like to ask you if you have any comment on these notes that I took while you were speaking. You referred to Aristotle and the Greeks, where for them there were two entities, matter and the mind. Today, what has helped me to develop was the presentation of quantum physics. I am no expert, but quantum physics gives us a new understanding of matter, not as two entities of body and mind, but rather that matter is energy, interconnectedness, which leads to, as you mentioned, dialogue and pluralism. And finally, my last comment is, I was hoping that someone would say that Christianity is more than religion. And finally, one way of expressing it, as one author said, is that Christ is the new Big Bang, that Christ is evolution. And there is no conflict. Thank you. I hope you can make a comment. What, am I out of order?
When you mention quantum physics, this is a field which everybody who knows anything at all about it says challenges our notion of what kind of world we live in, and shows that the ordinary common sense concepts that we have to think about the world with are not adequate. And the reason I spent so much time on the process stuff was that I think that something like quantum physics shows us that we don't have adequate intellectual equipment to understand the ordinary common sense world, let alone any realities that lie beyond it. And the reason I've always thought philosophy was worth doing is that it takes you back to the ordinary ideas you have and makes you examine them so to understand what they are. But of course it doesn't tell you what to do after that. After that, you have to see what resources you have available to you and try to think about new realities. Now, one source of suggestions about new realities has always been religion. But again, of course, not just one. There are so many of them. So you need to understand something about what each of them has to say. This sounds like religion is an awful lot of work. And of course, it is. Nobody who takes it seriously has ever suggested anything else. I think one of the great tragedies I felt in the days when I did university teaching was that we have so many things to learn just to get along in the day-to-day world that nobody thinks we ought to take academic time to try to understand what sort of universe we live in and why we're here. We seem to be so absorbed in trying to make a living that the curriculum doesn't have time for things like that. I think possibly things are changing, and I think the fact that there's a department that can put together a volume like this shows that all is not hopeless.
Just a quick comment. Do I have a chapter for you? If you're going to dip... by the way, where's the gentleman that just spoke? I can't see you. Well, there you are. Do I have a chapter for you? If you're going to dip in, then you need to dip in to John Polkinghorne's chapter, which is chapter 14, Science and Religion in the 21st Century. He is a theoretical physicist, and he makes a number of comments about how science and physics need to talk to one another with mutual respect. He thinks that the relational view of God, the Trinity, speaks to science today, and that science is maybe catching up to that idea, that we live in a relational world. So that particular chapter will be a nice starting point for you.
Doug, I want to
perhaps put you on the spot, but in your time as chair, and you have had many occasions to go out in the church communities, what is your impression of, say, how open are the churches to maybe becoming places? We all know that when institutions are under threat, they don't tend to become more liberal. They close down and become extremely rigid and defensive. You've seen many churches and many communities. Do you have a general sense of how things are, in fact, these days?
Thank you, Roy. I'm mindful of a conversation that Joe Woodard, our previous religion editor, had with, who was it? Douglas John Hall, I believe. And it was to the effect, well, the churches that are big, does it mean that they're doing something right? And his comment was, well, maybe they're giving people what they want to hear rather than what they should be hearing. I don't think that was the answer Joe Woodard was expecting. I don't think one can necessarily judge that, but I think churches are responding differently to the complex situation that we've described tonight. We've described the world getting more complex. Scholars are scrambling to stay on top of the new knowledge. Religious studies is changing constantly in the way it focuses its attention, even on the Christian past. The Christian past isn't the same. The Christian past that I teach now and that Ann Moore teaches now isn't the Christian past that we studied when we were students. That may sound ridiculous, but it's true. Our attention is different, our focus is different, our methods are different. It's a different Christian past. Now, I have the greatest respect for clergy. One reason that I'm teaching at the University of Calgary is that I decided I didn't have the talent it took to be a pastor in our day. It's a hugely demanding job to be a religious leader of any kind in our day, to do justice to the challenges that are there. So I'm hesitant to answer your question the way that you're asking it, Roy. I think what we are doing up here is offering a resource in many ways to people of faith. No Christian leader, no Christian period, no believer of any kind or non-believer of any kind can possibly stay on top of the issues in our world. And I think the humble role of the academic is to offer some modest kind of expertise that may shed a little bit of light on the issues that we're facing. And I would hope that people, Christians of goodwill and other people of goodwill, would be open to that. I would hope that we live in a day when we're, compared to a generation ago, I hope the answers are less simple. My wife and I talk sometimes about, the church that we attended when we were young and the way we believe now. And really there's a quantum paradigm shift that's gone on there. So it's tough to be a believer today. Charles Taylor's book that you and I discussed, Roy, he's saying it is hard to be a believer of anything today. We're cross-pressured. There are so many options. And so my answer to your question would be, I'm not one to judge. I think it's hard to be a believer today. And if those of us up in this panel can shed a little bit of light on some of those issues, that's the best we can do.
I wonder if one of the panel, or perhaps even all of the panel, could give me some definition of the concept of post-theistic Christianity, or whether the concept itself is oxymoronic or perhaps even moronic.
In the middle of a lecture I had to give on this once, quite some years ago now, I found myself saying, atheist Christians, for God's sake. And I think what some people, Harvey Cox and others, who were proclaiming the secularity of, I would say, our world, their world, the world then, proclaiming this with enthusiasm, there were certain liberating things that they had discerned in the fact that the world was very secular and fewer people seemed to believe in God than before. And I think all religious believers should face the fact that the secular world has liberated human beings from some restraints and constrictions and willingness to learn from unwillingness to learn. It's freed us, in some ways. But of course, to rest content with that and think you can construct a religious system out of that is such obvious nonsense, it baffles me that anybody ever contemplated it. I think what we now face is something very stark. There are a large number of people in the world, I can't possibly calculate percentages, and it varies, I'm sure, from place to place, for whom religion seems a closed option. They can't understand why anybody has religious convictions. They see no need for it. And if certainly many students I encountered were like this then, and I'm sure it's increased, not decreased. There are also those on the believing side who can't understand why these people can't understand them. I think we have, the only way of putting this is that people in the same world live in totally different worlds. The world, they can find a consensus on lots of details. What charities to subscribe to. You all subscribe to the United Way because you don't have to make the decisions, for instance. There are all sorts of things you can do in common, but what you describe yourself as doing is completely different depending on what thought world you live in. That is the world we live in, where there is this fundamental difference between one group of people and another. And this division, this standoff, it's not a clash, it's a standoff. People cooperating on the margins because they do not live in the same world as one another. This is, I think, a basic difficulty which the academy can do something about. You can, by teaching the right way, enlarge the imagination of the unbeliever so that the believer makes a bit more sense to him or to her than before. And you can enlarge the world of the believer so that the unbeliever's world makes a bit of imaginative sense to him or to her. That's something that only instruction can do. But of course, you need time in your curriculum to do this. And it's interesting to see you beginning to succeed when the students in the two groups start going after one another.
Post-theist Christian, is that? There's a reason why I stopped at 800 in doing my historical studies. Actually, one of the things that's of interest to me is doing the early stuff. I would go, oh, that's actually not anything new. In early Christianity, given its diversity with some of the texts, I can probably find you a post-theist Christian viewpoint at that point in time. The diversity of Christianity, I think, is one of the things that I find the most fascinating as a scholar. The range of intellectual thought that is held under this umbrella is a font of fascinating things to look at. And again, I would suggest that, again, that's something the Academy might be able to give back to Christian communities, is that understanding that there's this great intellectual diversity and discussion that has gone on for centuries that goes way beyond the limited canon of Augustine. So yeah, that would be my comment in reference to that.
Questions?
If I could just pick up on what Dr. Penelhum was saying, because this has fascinated me for a long time. This idea that there are two worlds, one of which is a world of believers and a world of unbelievers, at least when it comes to thoughts of God. And I'm just wondering, is anyone looking at that particular question? Maybe it's more for psychology, I'm not sure, but why is there this seemingly parallel universes in which we have people who seem to think that, or yes, they live their lives, I suppose, as believers in this metaphysical reality, and there are others who seem to believe nothing beyond the mundane, and why these parallel universes, if that's an accurate description of what the truth really is.
There's a book that is more expensive than this book, and it's a lot thicker than this book, and far less readable, but it's called A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, and that's essentially the mandate of his book, how to explain how we got here. He begins with a fascinating question. Why was it that in the year 1500, it almost went without saying that you believed in God and a world over which God exercised his providence? And now it makes perfect sense not to believe in God at all for so many. That's the project of his book. His answer is quite interesting. He says it's basically the burden of modernity. We live in an age of authenticity, of choice, of incredible jostling diversity, of galloping. He says our secular age, it isn't that people don't believe anything, it's that they believe so many different things. Some don't believe at all. I think his book would go a long way to addressing some of those questions you've asked. It is the burden of the age that we live in. And actually, I thought that Taylor himself is a Catholic Christian. I thought he would say, isn't this awful? He says, this is actually a better situation to be in than in an age in medieval Christian Europe where you really didn't have any choice and your Christian faith was a social expectation. He said that would actually be much worse, which is interesting.
Okay, and this question is not for Doug, because Doug hasn't read this book. But you've heard of Alain de Botton, who wrote Religion for Atheists, A Non-Believer's Guide. And I was wondering if you could tell me what you thought about his new institute. Do you think it's a church? And what do you think he thinks it is? He has set up an institute now for people, I can't find the name of it in my Kindle, but it is for living well, and it's in London. So has anybody got any thoughts on Alain de Botton?
By default. I think one of the most interesting things he's pointed out is something that has taken the Academy a while to catch up to. Again, it's this shift in which we are focusing on the great men and great ideas without paying attention to the fact that one of the things that has been so powerful with religion is the fact that it creates community. And so much of what one faces in terms of dealing with human life cannot be done by just thoughts and yourself. I know psychology thinks all you need is a therapist, and if you go for weekly therapy, it will be solved. That was for you, Christy. But that won't be solved. And that's, I think, one of the strongest points he makes. And I think a lot of, again, non-believers don't understand that dimension and misunderstand religion because of that. So in a sense, I think it's an interesting point he has made. I think he has made it well. I don't know about his institute. If he's trying to study religions and community interaction that would be interesting. Let's hope he doesn't turn it into a church. Yeah, that would be my comments.
Actually, I have one further comment to make on him. After reading that book, it made me feel like I really wish he'd been in a religious studies department. Partly because I think he makes a common mistake among him and a number of the other so-called new atheists. They define religion very narrowly. And so if he's interested in visions of human flourishing, which that book seems to be, that would be a pretty good definition for a lot of what religions do. And so in that sense, he's not post-religious. He's just producing a secular form of it. Yeah, yes, please.
I'd like you to pretend that I'm a seminary professor representing the theological colleges that train our pastors who serve in our parishes, yes, that's what I'd like you to pretend. And I have one question. If you could advise me, us, in terms of theological education, which is really experiencing a low point, the seminary, many of our seminaries and colleges across denominations are having diminishing numbers. And in the light of the things that are said in this book and the reflections you had this evening, if you could say one thing to us in terms of our theological education for this age, what would you say? Each one of you. You can't get out of this. It's for three answers to one question.
No, I don't want to start, but golly, I don't know that this is advice that is uniquely applicable to educators in your profession, but I would say it to everybody on both sides of this divide. And that is, don't, under any circumstances, equate those on the opposite side of the fence from you. Don't say of them that they are being frivolous. I find that nascent, I'm sorry to say, in Romans 1, there's a suggestion that people who don't see what I'm telling you are frivolous and unnatural. If unbelievers are right and God does not exist, then all you've got is therapy. All you've got is mutual help. And it's terribly urgent to decide whether God exists or not, because if you decide that he doesn't, you've got to set about setting up a human community in which you can help one another do what the religious traditions claim can be done by God for them, or God can cooperate with them in doing. So secularism can be a deeply serious point of view because it represents an attempt to set up ways of dealing with an emptier world. And it's terribly important to decide, therefore, before you spend all of your time in discussion, it's terribly important to decide whether God exists or not. So all the traditional discussions of what the evidences are and whether they're good enough are very important. They're not just academic exercises. And I've spent a lot of time in my career going over all these, and they're all very inconclusive, and it's all very difficult. But I can't think of anything else to be done. I'm sorry, it's not really especially helpful, but I think I think the temptation to dismiss the other side in those terms is terribly wrong.
I think that's very helpful, because I think one of the issues for religions is an arrogance that we have about our own point of view, which doesn't allow that. And I'm glad you brought that up.
I would sort of also echo what Terry is saying, in the sense that I think in some cases what I see is a move to simplicity, thinking that's what people want. I think the struggle in the terms of actually taking a look at what the tradition has left, and particularly in both ritual, material culture, and thought, and how those were useful for people at one point in time to try and explain human life and help them live human life. I think one needs to go back to that and see that struggle and connect with that struggle and see if those items are still speaking today, rather than giving the simplified version. Yeah, get buried back into the tradition.
There are a couple of chapters in this book that will address your question. Have you bought the book? Douglas John Hall says that Christian theology has to become more modest. And so I think that's echoing a point made earlier. Modesty is appropriate. The other thing would be, I think, faculty, curricula, students should develop a theology of world religions. Of course, in a Christian seminary, one identifies as Christian, but what about the other religions? I mean, a simplistic question to ask would be, are they of God, or are they of the devil, or are they of man, or of women? But the point is, what does one think about other faiths?
I don't like the way
You better be careful, Doug.
So I'm going to stop.
It might be an appropriate place to stop. Thank you very much to all our panelists for a very stimulating discussion, and to all of you for participating and asking questions. Before we draw our evening to a close, I'd like to ask Dr. Moore to explain to you, or describe to you, a new project of the chair and of the department.
Yes. As Doug has kept on saying, yes, the book is there to be used and to encourage use of the book. One of the things we have begun to do, and we're still in the process of continuing this, is to begin to list for you resource people in the academy that you can tap into, that you can literally contact these resource people on a given area or given subject and say, hi, your interest seems to be in such and such. We have adult education, or we're thinking of doing a book study. Can you come out and speak to us? And yes, we're composing that. The list is a work in progress. I always like that term. So you have a handout right now, but we're also going to be putting one up on the website for the Chair of Christian Thought. I think two things are of significant note with regard to this list. Number one, we are drawing from as many people as we can within the academy. So Clara Joseph from English, who's also an adjunct with our department, has offered her services. David Marshall from History will be up on the website. He's also going to poll some of his doctoral students in history to see if they'd like to engage in this. We're also, and this is the other thing, we're also offering, rather than us old fogies who have been doing this for a long time, we're also listing our graduate students who are, if you like, we feel on the cutting edge and will be the next generation of scholars. And so this provides them with an opportunity of how to engage with the community. But as I said, it also allows you to engage in people who are now the next generation and their excitement. So those are the initiatives. So we are there to be used, not abused, but to be used. And so please do.
Well, that draws our evening to a close. Thank you all for coming, and the refreshments. Please do feel free to engage our speakers further. Also, I'd like to mention that We have another contributor to the volume, Charles Neenkirken, in the audience there, so please do pin him down as well. And it only remains to show our appreciation to our panelists in the appropriate way.